Welcome to the second part in a three-part response to Anita Sarkeesian's latest instalment in the Tropes vs. Women in Video Game series, Women as Reward. You might recall in the first part that I gave my central objection to Anita's video, which was her claim that men's desires to see sex and sexuality within video games largely stems from a sense of male entitlement to women's bodies. I claimed that Anita was not just wide of the mark, but that I proposed that she was entirely wrong, and that rather than a sense of male entitlement to women's bodies, it is actually a sense of understanding that we don't have such a sense of entitlement that prepares us to settle for such a grotty second best. I also expressed disappointment at the way in which Anita felt about sexualized content in Easter eggs. And before anybody asks, I'm talking about sexualized content in in-game Easter eggs. Sure. Sexualized content in normal Easter eggs, crack open your egg, a load of hardcore porn spills out. Not really. I don't want to go over any of those objections again. In this video, what I want to deal with is a handful, about 8 different objections, further objections that I have that I kept out of that video to keep that video on focus. So, shall we get on with the first objection? One of the primary concerns I had pretty much all the way through her video, and something which came across as somewhat misleading to and manipulative of her audience, was the way in which she seemed to slide from facts to analysis to her feminist theorizing without ever giving us any indication of what she was doing. There was never any pause or acknowledgement that the world of certitude had been left and that we're entering this kind of world of speculation and conjecture. Generally what you would expect to see in a video, or at least you would hope to see in a video, is the person narrating the video to say something along the lines of, what I am proposing is X, or the argument that we intend to make in this video is Y, or some experts in this field have done some research and their research suggests Z, or if they're American scientists it might suggest Z. But something along those lines that gives us some idea that we're moving to a different type of thinking, a different type of understanding, and that there isn't the same rock solid certitude that we had when she was simply describing the footage that was being shown to us, that the things that we're talking about now are not beyond dispute, that people do question these things and that people do have different and variant interpretations to the interpretation that she was giving. And some of this brings us on to point 2. Where the hell are the references? She makes some pretty bold claims in this video, such as the one that I'll discuss a little bit later in the video, that sexualized rewards are included. They're actually designed into these games to validate the masculinity of the straight male player. That's a pretty bold claim to make, especially if you're not going to say, well, this is what I reckon is going on here, but to say it as if it's an unquestioned fact. If you're going to do that, you need to provide some references. Now, I understand they're not providing them in the video in some of our earlier videos. If you go to the transcript page, there are some references at the bottom there, some pieces of scientific research, social scientific research, which you can peruse at your leisure, or at least you can if you can afford to get behind the paywall. But in this occasion, it says at the bottom of a video, follow this link for a transcript link and resources. I followed the link. The transcript is there. There are no links and resources present. How can you make the claims with such certitude and then provide no references whatsoever? And an even more egregious example of this is the statement she makes about the origins of entitlement.
The critical thing to remember here is that men are not born with this sense of entitlement. It's a learned way of thinking that shapes the ways men relate to women and women's bodies.
Fantastic!
This attitude is taught through a complex socialization process impacted by a whole host of factors. Families, religions, peer groups, movies, pop music, mainstream pornography, and video games can all play a part in the construction and perpetuation of this mentality.
One thing you have to remember is that people such as Anita are often very, very heavily invested in the idea that our behaviours don't really have a biological underpinning. And the reason is because they have this kind of fear that if there is some kind of nativistic component to our behaviours, that it means that it either justifies those behaviours or it means that we can do nothing about it. it. And part of the problem is the conflation that they cause themselves between the idea of genetic determinism, which is a red herring, or the idea that we may have some kind of predisposition that best shows on a statistical level that leads people to err towards certain kinds of behaviour, and perhaps certain populations or certain groups towards one particular kind of behaviour a little more than another group. So for her, the idea that there may be some kind of nativistic, some kind of innate predisposition to involving men towards a sense of entitlement towards women or women's bodies is anathema. So when I heard her make this statement and express such certitude, my ears really pricked up. I thought, what is this based upon? This is really, really interesting, because the one thing I know, the one thing that experts agree upon is just how intractable this problem is, how difficult it is to tease apart nature versus nurture, and how difficult it is to make any definitive statements of the kind that she's made here. So I was really interested to know what this was based upon. So next we cut to the chase, and we're going to look at Anita giving us her definition for the trope itself, women as reward. And I think this definition acts as an exemplar for many of the issues that the video has as a whole.
We've coined the women as reward trope to describe a long-running pattern found in interactive media. It occurs when women, or more often women's bodies, are employed as rewards for player actions in video games. The trope frames female bodies as collectible, as tractable, or as consumable, and positions women as status symbols designed to validate the masculinity of presumed straight male players.
So I actually don't have a problem with the first part of the definition. After all, regardless of what you think about the video, regardless of what you think about this trope, we have to have a definition to be able to even to discuss it in the first place. And I actually think the first part of this definition does quite a good job of describing that. But it's almost as if Anita and her team couldn't help themselves. They had to include the analysis of the definition in the definition itself, which is a really hopelessly stupid thing to do. It's like redefining murder from unlawful killing to something along the lines of unlawful killing from people who probably had a terrible childhood and have issues of self-worth. The problem then is, where does it stand? If you falsify that latter part of it, then the whole trope falls down, even though those issues still exist. Women as reward definitely exists in video games, and yet we have this bit at the end about designed to validate the masculinity of presumed straight male players. How about if it's nothing to do with validating the masculinity of straight male players? What if it's just that guys like looking, they're just sexually attracted to women, and so it's a reward for them to view naked women? How mind-blowing though that is. What about if that's all that's at stake here, right? And what about if that's what games developers are doing? They're saying, do you know what? A lot of guys play our games, and a lot of guys like to look at naked women, so hey, let's put some naked women in. But what she says is, she says not only do these women as reward validate the masculinity of presumed straight male players, but they are designed. So this is a determined act on behalf of the game's developers to put this content into the game, not to titillate the player, right? Not because they know the player wants to see a bit of tit and ass. It's designed, they're thinking, we're putting this in here because we need to validate the masculinity of the straight male player. What an absolute load of shite that is. And the problem is that as soon as that bit falls down, then the entire definition falls down, so the entire trope is falsified. Can you not see what the problem is? Anita, if you watch this video, can you not see what a bad idea it is to include your analysis in the definition of the trope? What a terribly stupid thing to do. How can so much time be invested in this video in the series and then do something such as that? How myopic must you be in your viewpoint? How focused on your perspective rather than taking a wider view must you be to do something along those lines? Let's move on to the next objection.
Easter eggs are, of course, not inherently problematic, and gaming history is filled with examples of neat secrets that designers have hidden away for players to discover. When done well, collectibles inspire exploration and replayability. However, when they're designed to function as an extension of the women as reward trope, players are encouraged to view women's bodies as souvenirs of their adventures.
A couple of clips there, but the whole video seemed to be filled with these bits where there would seem to be this kind of lurch from the subjective to the objective that mirrored what I talked about before when we were talking about the facts of the video clips through to the analysis, through to Anita's feminist theorising. Here we had this kind of conflation between Anita's subjective feelings on what is these things such as rewards being done well with some kind of objective analysis of what these things being done well would consist of. This was perhaps the worst example of it.
Shifting to an example of a game that does alternative female costumes right, Alice Madness Returns features a wide assortment of imaginative, unlockable dresses. And if you must go the bunny girl or cat girl route, this right here is definitely the way to do it.
So clearly, according to Anita, a reward done well is a reward that appeals to Anita. How convenient is that? If I can give you what I think is perhaps a more objective way of looking of what makes a good reward in a video game, it would be reward that fulfills the function of a reward. And the point of a reward is to try and entice the player, to try and provide some kind of incentive for the player, and then to provide some kind of payback at the end, so that you wish to play the game, you wish to progress, you wish to take part in the mechanisms of the game and to sink time into the game, and that it doesn't fall flat at the end. You don't feel a sense of letdown at the end. You feel that you've got a reward that justifies the time and the skills that you've invested in playing that game. Now, in and of itself, despite what Anita says, I think that tells us nothing about sexualized rewards. But what I think everybody will agree upon is that sexualized rewards polarize people. For some people, sexualized rewards provide a great incentive and a good payback. But for other people, quite honestly, it maybe even turns them off the content. But isn't that the same with any kind of reward? Whatever type of reward you have is going to work for some people, and for other people it's going to leave them cold. And so perhaps the answer is, I propose, rather than working out rewards that you provide in a game based upon what would Anita Sarkeesian prefer to see, perhaps a better suggestion would be to choose a wide gamut of rewards. And a lot of games developers, those that have the nous and the resources, already do that. They provide resources for those people that want to upgrade their gear, resources for those people that like to collect things, for those people that do like some sexualized content, for those people that like visual treats or new areas or new bits to explore or quirky little things. Provide a wide basket of rewards, and then everybody is happy, everybody is incentivized, and everybody feels like they get their payback, and that in some ways they are being catered for by that product.
The women as reward trope presents women as a formalized reward mechanism, meaning that the reward is coded into the game system itself. The result of this incentive structure is that access to women's bodies, women's affection, or women's sexuality is reduced to a simple equation that guarantees delivery as long as the correct set of inputs are entered into the system. In this way, the women as reward trope helps foster a sense of entitlement, where players are encouraged to view women as something they've earned the right to by virtue of their gaming actions, skills, or accomplishments.
So cutting through the bullshit and rhetoric, and you may be advised to go back and listen to that a couple more times, what Anita has done is she has basically just described how video games work, but managed to make it sound like something sinister and horrifying. Video games provide us with rewards, and we get those rewards when we have success, and that success inevitably follows a series of inputs. You have to do the correct set of inputs with the correct timings, and then you achieve success, and then you get a reward. And that is how all video games work. If Anita has this objection, if she finds them something objectionable about that, in some ways leading to some sense of entitlement, because then you have done something and then you have an expectation of a reward, then she has a problem with video games, because that is how video games works. It's not fair to just take this selective approach and say, well, all these things, these mechanisms are a problem. but only look at it from this perspective of when sex is involved. It's absolutely fine when anything else is involved. When shooting people through the face is involved, that's fine. When stealing things are involved, that's absolutely fine. When other kinds of worldly goods are involved, that's fine. When there's other interactions with other people, then that is just fine. But whoa, sex is involved now, and all of a sudden we start looking into these mechanisms and the fact that in a video game, there's a target and you're trying to succeed, and there's a way of playing the game right, and when you play the game right you get the reward. I don't know what she wants. Perhaps she wants some kind of fucked up random video game where you just randomly move the joypad or the joystick or just randomly bash the keys, and then it just assigns you a score and a reward at the end of it, independent of what you've done. I don't know, maybe that sounds like the kind of game that the British programmer Jeff Minter would have made about 30 years ago, but I don't think it's going to work for most people today. Let's move on to the next one. So this next part of the video I found absolutely awful. How she could view this bit of footage from Double Dragon and then arrive at the conclusion she did absolutely beggars belief. Here's the footage.
At the end of the game, after the final boss has been defeated and the damsel in distress saved, Player 1 and Player 2 must fight each other over who gets to have Marian, and with her, the smooch of victory. Notice that Marian's desires are not part of the equation. She has no say in the matter. She simply fills the role of a trophy for whichever player is ultimately victorious.
I'll be honest, I've been dwelling on this one over the last few days more than any other part of this part, or the second part, or the third part of the video, because this one staggered me, this one baffled me, it's floored me. It floored me that Anita could watch that footage and then make the comment that she did, and obviously not to manipulate us, I'm assuming, because it's so blatant. She's just shown us the footage, we've seen the footage, so she must genuinely believe what she said. So let me just tell you the bit that let me just repeat what Anita said, which was that notice that Marian's desires play no part in the equation. She has no say in the matter. That is how Anita reads what she saw there. Let me show, this is what I'll do. Let me put Anita's words there, let me put the video there, and I'll just let it keep scrolling through. And Anita is interpreting that as Marian having no say. She's the passive one in this, and the player character, he is the active one, and she's being coerced, she's being forced, she has no say. She plays no part in that equation to kiss the player character. So I've dwelt on this, and the only thing that I can come up with, and I'll be honest, it's not very good, right? And I'll tell you why. What I've come up with is that this is a comment Anita is making on the whole thing about NPCs, non-player characters, which is that their behaviour is scripted. I'm trying to cut Anita some slack here. That NPCs' behaviour is scripted, so they have no say in their behaviour effectively. They have no free will, right? And so in this case, Marian has been scripted to go over and kiss the player character. She can't do anything other than that because that is in the code of the game. But if that is the case, and this is the problem with this as a suggestion for what Anita could mean, that applies to every single NPC that's ever been made. That applies to a game where you kill terrorists, because it means you can't say, well, that's okay, we're shooting terrorists because they're terrorists. Well, not really, because they're only terrorists because the game's developers have coded them as terrorists. When you see them commit that act of terrorism, they're only doing that because the game's developers are making them do it. Right, so I just can't believe that is Anita's argument. But if that isn't Anita's argument, look at what we've got here. Look at what we're working with here. The player's character doesn't move. After she's cut down, the player's character just remains absolutely motionless. And it is Marian that comes up to the player. She is the primary motivator in all of this. She is the sexual aggressor, if you like, in terms of this kiss. It is only in the very, very last last frame of animation that the player's character does anything at all. And to me this just typified the distorted way that Anita Sarkeesian seems to both view and report on video games content, and especially the skewed way in which she seems to analyse any such content that involves interactions between male and female characters. Really, if there's just one thing that I could get Anita and just sit her down in front of me and say, Anita, I really would like to know, how did you get from A to B here? How did you manage to view this content and then arrive at the conclusion that you've brought before us? Well, anyway, look, let's leave that one to one side. Let's move on to the last objection that I have, which is actually an objection that fits in not just to this video, but to many videos in a series.
Let me emphasize that the problem here is not necessarily that sex is included in these games.
Now, when you know it never is, Anita, is it? Your problem isn't that sex has been included in games. Your problem is just every single instance where sex has ever been included in games. And I think that kind of gives you an inkling of what is at issue here. And it's a biggie, this one, and it chimes in with a lot of your series because you've made similar comments before. And there's two different ways in which you can provide a kind of prohibitive moral pressure to stifle content you don't like, and one is to say outright that's just unacceptable, right? So let's say showing horrific graphical images of child sexual abuse in video games is just beyond the pale and it should never exist within the format of video games. And the second is to just place so many hurdles, so many boxes that have to be ticked, so many potholes that have to be maneuvered around, that effectively within the medium that we're talking about, it's just impossible to incorporate that anymore. I could give you an example of that. I could say, okay, I've no problem with soldiers being killed in video games, absolutely no problem whatsoever, but we have to realise that soldiers are real people. That when soldiers join, sometimes they're cajoled, sometimes they're missold what's going to happen in the military, sometimes they don't expect to be in the firing line, and we need to see some of that backstory of any soldiers that are going to be mown down. What about their families? What about their husbands? What about their wives? What about their children? What's going to happen to them? Now, I don't mind you killing soldiers in video games, but we need to make sure we flesh out the character like some kind of art house film that goes on for 3 hours with just one little bit of action, perhaps right at the end. We need to know all that before we kill a soldier in a video game. So no, I've no problem with soldiers being killed in video games, but 99% of video games where soldiers are killed you cannot make from this day. Hence, if you intend not to fall foul of the objections that I'm going to raise, because what I've said, it's just absolutely fantasy world to think that that is compatible with a world of video games where you go around in your first person shooter wiping down soldiers 12 to the dozen, right? So that's effectively what you're doing with regard to sex. Oh, you're absolutely fantastic, Anita. You have no issue with sex in video games, and we can crack on with sex and sexuality in video games as long as we fulfill this unrealistic list that means that effectively we're never going to see any sex in video games. Brilliant! Fantastic work, Anita. A lot of people won't respect you for that, but I kind of respect the cynical manipulation that underpins that, because that takes a little bit of thought to do that. So this now draws a line under the objections. I hope you've enjoyed part 1. I hope you've enjoyed this part 2. Part 3 is something a little bit different. I'm going to try and tease out some positives from this video and perhaps think, well, what can we think about with regard to this women as reward trope? And is there perhaps some issues that we ought to be considering, even if there isn't in terms of the way that Anita has framed it? Thank you for watching this part. I'll see you at the next part.